Let me give you a very practical example. Even at Anumana, the way that I forced myself to stay disciplined in that process, I committed myself to hold a town hall for all the employees week after every board meeting. And in that town hall, I would always update anything on the strategy front of what we were doing. And then I would update on, the progress to date and the operational priorities from here to the end of the year. And then I had that scheduled, as soon as we were scheduling out the board meetings, we'd schedule that. And I set this expectation. That also put a stake in the ground where I was holding myself accountable by doing that touch point in front of other people and ensuring that the tyranny of the urgent wasn't overwhelming my day to day, eroding my success.
Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of The Strategy Gap. Joining us today for our conversation is David McMullin. David has more than 2 decades experience in corporate development, strategic planning, commercialization, and operations across multiple sectors in the life sciences industry. In addition to serving currently as Chief Business Officer of Anumana, he's also the Chief Strategy Officer at Inference. Prior to joining Anumana and Inference, he served as the Chief Business Officer of Aldera Therapeutics, a NASDAQ-listed biotech company. He ran U.S. internal medicine and was the head of global commercial operations at Shire, a $1.4 billion rare disease and specialty pharmaceutical company. And prior to his work at Shire, he was the vice president of global supply chain management and strategy at Novartis. He holds an MBA with high distinction as a Baker Scholar from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree in economics from Brigham Young University. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's great to be here with you and Joe.
Yeah. So before we get into the heart of the conversation, and we'll talk about a lot of great things around strategy creation and execution, I wanted to give you a bit more of a chance to talk a bit about your background and specifically Anumana. So will you mind giving our listeners a quick overview of Anumana and what you're doing there?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Delighted to. Anumana is a software as a medical device company. It's a startup. It's now 3.5 years old. And its genesis story is founded on this premise that we can use AI to make standard of care tests smarter and do so in a way that can actually transform clinical care of patients. So we're focused on cardiology, and we go and we look at what are the standard tests that are being used in cardiology today, and where are those tests providing information that with the rich data that's available at a medical center could be improved using AI techniques. So we've started our journey with using the electrocardiogram or the ECG as the backbone of the algorithms we build. And then to turn them into tools that a clinician can use, we have to create medical grade software that houses those algorithms. So that's the journey that we're on. I said we started with electrocardiograms. We're also doing algorithms that use other modalities in the cardiology space, even into the interventional setting. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing here at Anumana. We're just now a Series B company. We've got 2 FDA clearances. We're just starting our commercialization journey as we build out the pipeline.
Very cool. I think it's certainly an interesting intersection of a lot of different aspects, right? You've got medicine, you've got your role, that's some aspect of strategy. But then you've got a big hot topic, of course, today is AI. So how do you think about, the intersection of AI and medicine? Obviously, there's, I think, a lot of good things that are coming out of AI. There's a lot of, negative aspects about AI. And probably there's a little bit of concern for most people that think about how does AI incorporate itself into the medical practice? How do you think about that intersection between the two?
Yeah, we all know that AI right now is almost become a buzzword where everyone's talking about it. That has its a good side as well as a downside. The good side is a lot of people are generally aware and even experiencing or more aware when they experience AI in their daily life. The downside is there is a lot of fluff out there. There's a lot of that's said about AI, probably by people who aren't really in a position to talk about it. And that's very important when you come to healthcare, because with healthcare, obviously we're dealing with the health and well-being of patients. And so the technology needs to be medical grade. And so I think fundamentally, very, there's some very practical things that are being done already to ensure that AI, when it's applied into the healthcare space, is done the right way. And one is like with our technology, it's defined as a medical device category now. The FDA has issued guidance on AI software as a medical device. The regulations are being written. So, like for our technology, the first product to get cleared required what's called a de novo. So the FDA actually wrote a new section in the Code of Federal Regulation that specified that for this technology to get on the market, it needs to be clinically validated. Like some of the worries about AI have to do with things like a bias in the algorithms that you create. However, there's ways that we can get around that. The randomized clinical trial, or with AI software, you also have the benefit of being able to leverage retrospective data to demonstrate that what you build in a test environment can be generalized, and that if there is bias, you can uncover it and determine it appropriately. So that's probably the biggest thing that can be done in healthcare for medical device related AI. I won't speak to like business process AI, but the medical device related AI, it should be treated in a similar fashion as any medical device or intervention technology. You need evidence to demonstrate that it's efficacious, and you need evidence to demonstrate that you've checked all the risks and understand what the risk factors may be when the product's in utilization.
It's super interesting because, I mean, a lot of the topics we talk about here is when we're creating strategy for the future, business strategy, what have you, it's what time horizon should we be looking at? And sometimes some organizations we work with are more stable and there's less change, and they're looking 3-5 years out. With the role that you have and the business that you're running, I mean, ultimately we're talking things can change on a weekly, monthly basis. So how have you managed to be able to have a long-term vision at the same time managing the fact that that vision and that direction you're going could potentially move and shift more rapidly than other industries? How have you managed to keep the North Star in sight?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe, and it really is a part of the reality. I mean, we are at Anumana, it's a startup, so we're building an organization where we need to have that long term vision, and we do have that. We have a picture of what we think the future will look like with our technology, and it will look different than today. But and then we break it down into steps. In order to make that change, we have to roll out our technology. We have to do things like change the way products are coded in the marketplace. We have to do things like eventually, change the way guidelines are written to associate the proper use of our technology. And that long-term vision is important because it helps you identify and prioritize the work you need to do today. But because we're a startup, we also need to have quick wins. And so we need to find within that path the discrete milestones that we can hit in a discrete timeline. Because generally, when you go to investors, they want to see that you have a vision, and they want to see the evidence to believe in that vision. And that can be like 5 years plus. But they also want to know that if they're investing in you, that you're going to translate that into some de-risking milestones or value generation milestones, that directly bring in cash in the next year or two. And so it's constantly blending those things. But I would say what's different here than when I worked at larger organizations, we don't really have like just separate strategy sessions and like budgeting sessions. It's sort of like all part of the same thing, and we're constantly kind of adjusting as we go. And because we're a small organization, we can have a flexible, nimble process like that. It's easier to align, a smaller group of people and adjust in real time.
Yeah, and certainly there's a lot to dig in around kind of that startup space, and as you grow and that comparison from your career from a larger organization to a startup organization. And I think for the remainder of the conversation, we really want to dig into how you kind of think about those selections and how you scale and grow and balance innovation and balance scaling aspects and doing those constructively together. But starting from that beginning, one thing we see a lot of organizations struggle with is the typical way to talk about it is there's a red ocean strategy and blue ocean strategy and which space you want to compete in. And I think even outside of that metaphor, as a startup, you have so many different things that you can do, right? And in the context of your organization or within AI or within healthcare, there's so many things that you could have placed a bet on as, hey, this is where we're going to start. So whether you're thinking about it from your experience at Anumana or just from a general business perspective as a whole, how do you begin to think about how to make these strategic selections of how we're going to begin or how we're going to take that next step when you have this world of opportunity in front of you from a business standpoint?
I mean, in my experience at large companies, I had the opportunity to work at like very high performing multinational corporations, and there I think I saw examples of what's best in class in terms of strategic planning. It's basically like your strategic. You have a defined strategic planning process that you actually invest time in, and you collect information, new information from outside the organization to inform what you want to do, and you design it in a way where you wrap that up prior to the next year's budgeting cycle. And so, you do it annually, and one like follows the other. Now, in my prior roles, when I was at these larger organizations, it was a significant investment of the CEO's time and also the other executives, as well as staff, who were supporting that process and, collecting the new information, doing advisory boards or the different sources that were used to inform the strategy. You need that same sort of thing at a startup, but you don't have the infrastructure or the resources. So what you do, what I have found, or at least one lessons in kind of this latest chapter of my career of doing startups, is you can take the semblance of those kind of best in class processes, and you can boil them down and get like let's say 80% of the value out of it in a way that is very doable with at very small scale. Like you can do it by yourself if you need to, or if you have like a small team, you can do it with 3 people, 5 people, because the value really comes by carving out time to think and apply your thinking, right? And so, you can use different frameworks like Red Ocean or Blue Ocean, or some of when I was in business school, some of my favorite strategy professors were Michael Porter or Clayton Christensen. Various people have come up with like various ways of thinking about business problems. In my experience, there's always like a mix of different types of frameworks that you need to find to apply to the situation that you're dealing with now. And like even in the organization of Anumana, where we literally every minute is used, we have carved out time to do a prioritization process. And we used external advisors. We didn't pretend like we would be able to, see all the gaps in our thinking ourselves. So we involved external advisors, but we did it with like, 3 key people. And then of course, because we couldn't involve too many people because we couldn't allow it to distract, but we did align, the broader organization. And it's important to take, this vision of the company and translate it into something that's tangible and understandable to every employee in the company. And basically that boils down to what are we going to do with our time in the next quarter, in the next year? And do I understand it well enough as an employee where I can associate what I'm required to do for my job description with what we're trying to accomplish as a company? That I think is critically important as part of that process.
You bring up an interesting topic that comes up once in a while on the podcast, which I live in the Morristown area. So if I squint, I can see a couple multinational pharmaceutical companies. I started my career at one as well. And I have the same idea as you, where I learned a lot in the time that I was there, 7 or so years at Merck specifically. A lot of what I learned, I was able to, when coming to achieve it in startup mode, distill it down and saying, oh, their training program was great. We don't have the resources to replicate that here, but there are elements I wish to replicate. And so from your perspective, I always ask the question, it's like, was it best to start at a larger organization and use those learnings to now apply to what you're doing now? Or would it have been better to be inverted where you started small and went big? How do you think, based on your experience, if you had a magical time loop here, how do you think that the big organizational learnings have helped you, or would you rather it be the other way around if you could do it again?
I know that's a really good question. And of course, like with my background, I might be biased and say like, start big and go small. But actually, I think the answer is it depends on the stage of the company. But I do believe very early on, you benefit by having a mix of both in the organization. Right. So, and I do think at the very, very early stages, at least this is now my 5th startup, and all of the startups I have been part of, they have had founders that included individuals that were doing this idea like very early on in their career, right? And sometimes they were paired with someone else who, had more operational experience. And that very early stage founding, that's where I think just, striking out of business school and trying to chase an idea, sometimes that's what's needed, to take an innovation and put some meat on the bones, if you will, like start to create something real out of something that's conceptual. But it doesn't take long when you're raising money. That operational experience at some level is going to be demanded by the investors. I've never met an investor who just will, give out money without having some assurance of what's going to happen with that money. And we tend to index on prior experience as being a good way to measure some level of expectation of future performance. And at some stage of the company, now sometimes you can build that experience yourself. So you raise like $50,000, and then you go to whatever $200,000, and then maybe you go to $2 million, and maybe you can do that yourself because you're showing along the way that you can deploy those resources effectively and basically build your experience as you go. For Anumana, we were at a different scale where we initially raised $20 million, right? And that was our first full round. We had seed before that. And then the next one we did 60. And so we start to get to that scale, at least in my experience. I have found that you need a blend of people who have operational experience, who've managed, budgets and organizations in the tens of millions of dollars, and, have an idea of how to deploy it. And how to make the trade-offs of accomplishing what you need to accomplish, while especially in my space, ensuring that all the quality and compliance things are built up to have a really robust organization.
I think naturally when the conversation comes up around startup versus large organization, the topic that many people are thinking about is kind of the innovation aspect of a small organization, the agility, the ability to create new ideas and move quickly, versus maybe not verse, but compared to the large scale of an organization that has systems and process, has scaled up to that point and has that experience. And if I were to take, my previous question around picking those ideas, if we were to fast forward into the future and assume that, yes, we picked the right ideas, naturally that next step for a startup organization is, okay, how do I scale? And better yet, how do I scale while still balancing that innovation that got us to the point that we're at where we are now? So how have you thought about that throughout your career, natural conflict point between scaling and innovation, and making sure that you have a strong balance between the two of those?
Yeah, here I think I first started thinking about it while I was at large organizations, actually, and that was because there was a dearth of innovation, and the large organization had so many processes which were able at sort of incrementally improving the business and growing the business, but not really designed to come up with breakthroughs. And when I was in a large organization, and by the way, like in full disclosure, a lot of my thinking was shaped by the teachings of Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School. And, he had this very popular class calling Building a Sustainably Successful Enterprise. And he was big on training the business students to, when you approach a business problem, do your best to be explicit about the hypotheses that you're founding your decisions on. Like what makes you think that decision will work? And the reason he would try to teach people to think that way, so then you'll be more likely to see your potential blind spots instead of just sort of going by instinct and thinking that, you've got it covered. And so like in a large organization, what that led me to is, and I did this several times at several different companies. One, I would show when I was in a role, of significant responsibility that I could hit my objectives, that I could get done what needs to be done for sustaining the organization and growing it. But then advocate that there's breakthrough innovation that's an opportunity that's being left on the table. And in order to go after that breakthrough type of innovative thinking, I would advocate that I needed independent resources as an explicit investment in that. And sometimes I literally would call it like a skunk works. And just to give you like one example, when I was running like commercial operations at a multinational corporation, what I wanted to do was bring in PhD statisticians and AI type of developers who could leverage our data and do things with our data that our current processes, didn't require. So we didn't hire people of that profile. So carving out those resources. Now, in the startup environment, I think it's exactly the same. Like as you bring in, new profiles to build out, to scale the organization, you have to start to standardize. You have to create swim lanes. You have to create repeatable processes. You have to, put sort of these guardrails in place. And that allows you to become bigger and stronger. But for the innovative people, it's like slowing you down, right? And so what we've done at Anumana is we've built that up in parallel, and we've kept the core R&D work as a standalone organization. And it's small. And it's got those innovative people in it. They know that once the innovation gets to a point, it has to go through a design control process, which is much more controlled. But that's the only way you can create medical grade technology. But that little engine of sort of discovery is still down there and able to operate. And it's got some messiness to it, and its purpose basically is to come up with ideas and patent the ideas, or, trade secrets, that type of thing. That's how it's creating value. But then it literally goes to different teams that we're scaling. You do sometimes find profiles of people who will start in one area and go to the other. I think it's not uncommon. It's probably more common to find people who are kind of in one camp or the other. Either they're wired in a way where they want to work on rapid problems and they want to get it to a point where they can hand it to someone else to really operationalize it and turn it into, something like medical grade technology. And the converse is the same. There's some people who, just want to really scale something, and you need a mix of both. So at least in my experience, it's always been kind of a carved out portion to do that exploratory, innovative piece.
Another theme you hit on that comes up quite a bit, and it's always interesting to get different perspectives, is how to balance the necessity of operational excellence, because especially in certain industries that you've worked in, and healthcare specifically, those operational pressures are real. And as an organization, we help different companies bridge that gap between, we said we're going to do these things, and here's what we actually were able to do. And one of the reasons when we asked, well, what didn't work in the past, was they weren't able to actually carve out any time to think about the future and being strategic, because they were so bogged down in the operational. And you mentioned one of the ways you said, I need specific resources that will only be solely working on that, so that we can make headway on that. So that's one interesting tactic, to say, like, explicitly, I need these people that's their job. So they're not obsessed. They're not sucked into the whirlwind of daily operations. But what other tactics have you employed or deployed within your roles in your various organizations to make sure there's enough time to be strategic, and you're not just putting out fires day after day, and you blink and a year has passed and no real innovation has happened? How have you managed that pull that comes along with it?
As the organization gets larger, you can start to sort of differentiate those roles. But when it's smaller, at some point it comes down to an allocation decision, right? I think I would say that's part of the secret sauce of an entrepreneur being successful. At some level, like when you go down, you have to have executives who ensure that what you described, Joe, doesn't happen, that you don't just get caught up. And either end of the spectrum, it can be a derailer for an organization, but you have to ensure that you're balancing both and talking about both. Now, the easiest way to do that is to assign people, right? And different people to do different things and resource it that way. There's often where that's not possible. And so when we first founded Anumana, there were three of us, working on it. And I had to just carve out time where I could read published literature, and explore ideas. Right now, that couldn't be my whole day, every day sort of thing. But if I didn't carve out the time and focus on it, I wouldn't be able to come up with a well-informed storyline of what I think is possible in the future. Probably 2/3 of my day at a minimum was okay, now what are the things we need to get done to hit the, de-risking milestones we need to hit? And how do we get that done between now and the next board meeting, for example? And just balance those things. But if you're not, checking in on yourself, and making it a part of the way that you schedule your time, you're going to trip at some point along the path. And then as you grow an organization, you have to instill that in other people until you get to a point where you can actually create swim lanes. You say like, okay, this group is doing this specific set of activities, these others are not. So that's, I guess, as we've grown the organization, it's been, it doesn't have to be a large set who have to sort of bounce between those two, but it has to be, the key people, sort of the executives and key people from the next direct reports who are ensuring that that's the way that the company's run. And let me give you a very practical example. Even at Anumana, the way that I forced myself to stay disciplined in that process, and that was I committed myself to hold a town hall for all the employees a week after every board meeting. And in that town hall, I would always update, anything on the strategy front of what we were doing. And then I would update on, the progress to date and the operational priorities from here to the end of the year. And so and then I had that scheduled, as soon as we were scheduling out the board meetings, we'd schedule that. And I set this expectation that also put a stake in the ground where I was holding myself accountable by doing that touch point in front of other people and ensuring that it wasn't getting, the tyranny of the urgent wasn't overwhelming my day to day and eroding my success.
Make a good point, because at publicly traded companies, the quarterly earnings report is definitely something that people pay attention to, especially at the upper echelons. But in a startup, you have a board meeting. That board meeting is happening whether you like it or not, and there's a lot of pressure to get something done. So that point that you're making, I think, hopefully drives a little bit of what you're saying, which is you can't get complacent because that next board meeting is coming quickly. So the idea of spending a third of your time thinking about where you want to go and 2/3 of your time really working on those milestones to get there is, I think, a good bit of advice for folks that are struggling with that prioritization, where right now they might be saying to themselves, I'm spending 0% of my time thinking strategically. If you can bump that up to a third, that's a good place to start. It's not Mount Everest. You don't have to do an inversion. You can just ease it in. And I think that's really great advice, because we get this question all the time.
Yeah, and I think one thing I loved about what your last answer was, David, is you talked about holding yourself accountable, giving those individuals insight into how things are progressing. And I think one natural transition point that happens to kind of tie everything together in our conversation today is at a certain point in an evolution of a company, the way you think about strategy changes, right? In some aspects, an organization is going to have this top-down strategy. At some point, they're going to have that. At some point, they're going to have more an emergent strategy where, hey, we just have to learn and iterate and try things, and we're going to have to adapt our strategy as we go. And then you might flex back and forth between those two. And in either of those cases, it's important to communicate, to your point, how you're progressing and what those expectations are to the organization. But kind of going back to that again, another conflict between top-down, full fleshed out strategy versus that emergent strategy. How do you balance and transition between those two as well?
That's a great question, Jonathan. And my answer might be an articulation of my current reality, but I've come to a conclusion that it always needs to be a hybrid of both. I really think that that's the reality. And I think that applies. I can't prove that to you, but I think that really does apply regardless of the size of the organization. And it's because there's just never a situation where enough at an organization level to purely have a top down. But there's almost never a situation where you don't face something that clearly needs to be top down. And so, and then the converse is also true, right? Like there's almost never an organization that can't benefit from a bottom up of hearing, what is working, what's not working, and adapting. And I think there's almost never a situation where that left to its own devices will get you where you need to go. And how do you actually implement that? That's probably the tricky part, because I think most people come to strategy without spending, 2 years in business school thinking about business strategy or, whatever. Most people come to strategy as just a part of their job. And as the organization gets bigger, you have more people who are just, subject matter experts in some area, and they're working in a function. Maybe they got a master's or a PhD in something else. They're in regulatory quality, product development. And they don't typically organically just know or understand or appreciate the difference between top down and bottom up. And usually when they think about strategy, it's only top down. And they actually need to be explicitly kind of coached and educated on the concept of a bottom up. And that is an explicit part of our strategy. And so that's probably what I've experienced most recently, with an organization. Like, pick your function. It could be marketing, it could be sales. You'll often have employees say like, well, what's the strategy? And, when you show the strategy, you point to the last quarterly, town hall and say, hey, look, this is where we're going. This is what the objectives are for today. And then they'll say, well, what about this situation here? And that's an example where, the top-down approach is not going to dictate what needs to happen. We need to learn, from the market and get feedback and then adjust and continue to adjust. So there's probably, that element of translating. Strategy is something where it's easy to talk about. It's actually, I think it can be hard to make your culture one that has a mature understanding of strategy and embraces it as part of the way it does the work as it moves forward. And again, my philosophy is it is pretty much always going to be a blend of top down and bottom up. And you need to educate the team so that they see the reality in that framework. And they understand the difference between discovering something from the market and feeding it up versus, the direction that's being given from the top-down analysis.
Yeah, because the top down hopefully allows you to get a little bit more isolation on your focus areas, but then the bottom up makes sure that you're not missing anything, and also making sure that people feel connected, that it's our strategy. We're in this together versus this was something that was given to us upon high. There's a real benefit, especially in the beginning, when you have people that are joining on the idea of this is going to be something big in a few years. That's so critical, and as you've lived through. So I think that's sage advice, because that's. The question is always top down, bottom up, but the answer is why pick one if you could blend the two together for the best outcome. So I appreciate that. But as we draw to a close, we always tend to ask the same question of all of our guests to impart wisdom upon us. And ultimately, if you were able to go back to the beginning of your career, your first role, and give yourself one bit of advice from yourself to yourself in terms of your journey in the strategy formulation and execution space, what advice would you give yourself to change the trajectory or make things different for yourself?
That's a really good question. I think the advice that I'd give to myself is that, keep learning and you can learn from everyone in the organization. Like some of what I've gained through experience is sometimes some of the best insights or just really profound business insights comes from the most unexpected sources. You could have a member of the team who, does not have professional training in, shaping and building organizations, and yet has insight on what needs to be done for the organization's culture that are very, very profound, like as one example. And I think that is something that if we all embrace, we have an opportunity to become better in our roles, no matter what we're doing, right? Like every one of us has something to give to the organization, but every one of us also needs to continue to grow, from our experiences in the organization.
Well, perfect, Dave. I appreciate your time today and all the insights you shared. I know our listeners will appreciate your insights and perspective, and we look forward to catching up again in the future.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Joe. This has been great. I wish you all the best in your endeavors.